Caitlin Clark was not vertical off of that. Gets Chelsea Gray. Watch here at the end. Gets her on the forearm, which is where I believe the foul was called.
What I would love Caitlin to do is get up one time and then just slap the out of her.
If the NBA is going to review calls, you're saying the WNBA can review calls and act retroactively.
I mean, isn't bullying, like, let's look at the NBA. Bullying on the court is a thing that has happened before.
It is a rite of passage, and it is a sign of respect. And for someone who doesn't know the game, for you to use certain words, we've got to be careful with our words. She's not getting beaten. She's not being bullied. No one's pulling her hair. No one's telling her she can't come out and play with them. That is a sign of respect. If I go at you because you're supposed to be a superstar, you're supposed to take it. Ask LeBron. Ask Michael Jordan. Ask the greats. It's a sign of respect. No one's bullying.
And when she gets asked that,
picture this. You are already hurt. You have already missed 5 games. You are playing on a minute's restriction because 18 days ago, someone drove a fist into your throat and put you on the injury report for 3 weeks. You are not 100%. Everyone in the building knows it. And then, right there on the court in Las Vegas, you take an elbow directly to the midsection and hit the floor. Now here is where it gets insane. The referees review it. They pull up the monitor. They look at the play from multiple angles with full video evidence in front of them, and when the dust settles, the foul goes on you. The player who took the elbow, not the player who threw it. That is not a missed call, that is a pattern. And the pattern has a name, a growing list of incidents, and now, finally, a consequence attached to it. Chelsea Gray has officially been suspended, and what that suspension reveals about the WNBA, its officiating, its culture, and the war being waged around Caitlin Clark is something every fan of this league needs to hear. Let's get into it. To understand why July 12th, 2026 matters so much, you need to understand the full weight of what was sitting on that court before the opening tip even happened. The Indiana Fever were walking into the Aces building for the second time in 8 days. The first trip had ended in a 16-point blowout, with Indiana handling Las Vegas on their own floor in a way that sent a very clear message about where these two teams stood heading into the second half of the season. The Aces are the defending champions. They are the standard in this league. They have a Ja Wilson, one of the most dominant players in WNBA history, anchoring their lineup. And the Fever had just walked into their house and handled them by double digits without their best player operating anywhere close to full strength. That detail matters more than almost anything else heading into this game. Caitlin Clark was not healthy. She had not been healthy since June 24th, when Alyssa Thomas made contact with her throat in a play that sent shockwaves through the basketball world and put Clark on the injury report for weeks. The back injury that resulted from that incident had already cost Clark 5 games this season. 5 games missed. And now, 18 days later, she was back on the floor under a minute's restriction, meaning the Fever's coaching staff was carefully managing exactly how long she played, because they understood that she was not physically capable of handling a full load. Let that sink in for a second. The most watched player in women's basketball, the player who has single-handedly driven television ratings, ticket sales, and mainstream attention to the WNBA at a level this league has never seen before, was walking onto that court in Las Vegas at somewhere well below 100%. Everyone in that building knew it. The coaches knew it. The officials knew it. The Aces players knew it. And that context does not sit in the background quietly when you start looking at what happened next. The Fever coming into this game were also riding genuine momentum. Despite Clark's injury and her limited availability, Indiana had shown during their road trip that they were capable of winning without her playing her full game. The team around her had stepped up. Kelsey Mitchell had been carrying an offensive load that put her in historic company. Aaliyah Boston was doing damage in the paint. Sophie Cunningham had been knocking down shots at a rate that was making opposing defenses pay for focusing too much attention elsewhere. This was not a one-woman show, and the results were proving it. But make no mistake, Clark's presence, even on a minute's restriction, even at less than full strength, changes the entire dynamic of any game she is in. Her gravity on the court forces defenses to make decisions they would not otherwise have to make. Her vision and passing create opportunities that would not exist without her. And her competitive energy, the way she attacks every possession and demands accountability from officials when calls go wrong, sets a tone that elevates everyone around her. The Las Vegas Aces, on the other side, were coming into this game fully aware of what the stakes were. 2 losses at home to the same team in 8 days would be a serious statement about where the Aces stood as a championship contender. They needed this game. They needed to show their home crowd and the rest of the league that the first blowout was an anomaly, that the defending champions were capable of responding, that having a Ja Wilson and Chelsea Gray on your roster still meant something in a world where the Fever had suddenly become the most dangerous team in the conference. Chelsea Gray, specifically, is someone who deserves attention in this context. Gray is a veteran point guard who has been in this league long enough to have seen everything. She has championship rings. She has been in high-pressure situations more times than she can count. She is not a player who makes mistakes accidentally. When Gray does something on a basketball court, it is deliberate. It is calculated. That is what makes her so effective. And it is also what makes what happened in the first half of this game so impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The atmosphere in Las Vegas that night was already charged before the ball was tipped. Fever fans who had made the trip were ready to watch their team do it again. Aces fans were ready to see their team bounce back. And sitting in the middle of all of it, operating under a minute's restriction with a back injury that had cost her nearly 3 weeks of her season, was Caitlin Clark. What happened in that first half did not just affect the outcome of one basketball game. It added another chapter to a story that has been building since Clark's very first day in this league. And the chapter that got added on July 12th is one that the WNBA is going to be answering questions about for a very long time. Because what was coming next would make the Thomas incident look like a warning that nobody took seriously enough. There's a version of this story where you could look at the play in isolation, strip away every bit of context, ignore the injury history, ignore the pattern, ignore everything that came before it, and still walk away thinking that something was deeply wrong with what happened in that first half. But when you add the context back in, when you stack this moment on top of everything else that has happened to Caitlin Clark in this league over the past several weeks, the play stops looking like a basketball incident and starts looking like something much more deliberate. Here is exactly what happened. Clark was defending Gray in the post. That is a matchup that, under normal circumstances, would favor the bigger and more experienced player. Gray is a seasoned veteran who has used her body and her craftiness to create advantages against defenders throughout her entire career. She knows how to manipulate space. She knows how to use fakes to generate contact that benefits her. This is not speculation. It is a fundamental part of how Gray has operated as a player for years. Gray received the ball and immediately went into her move. She threw 2 fakes in quick succession. And here is the detail that every analyst who has broken down this play keeps coming back to. Those fakes were not designed to get Gray open for a clean shot. They were designed to create contact. The footwork, the body positioning, the timing of the elbow extension, all of it was structured in a way that used Clark's defensive positioning against her and drove an elbow directly into Clark's midsection. The elbow connects. And Clark, who has been dealing with a back injury for 18 days, who is playing on a minute's restriction specifically because her body is not at full strength, drops to the floor immediately. Now, the people pushing the flop narrative will point to that moment, to Clark going down, and say that she was being dramatic. They will say that an elbow to the midsection should not put a professional athlete on the floor. They will say that Clark is known for selling contact and that this was just more of the same. Here is why that argument collapses under the slightest scrutiny. Caitlin Clark has already missed 5 games this season with a back injury. She is not playing a full schedule because her body cannot handle it right now. She is on a minute's restriction. Her coaching staff is actively managing her health on a game-by-game basis. When a player in that physical condition takes a hard elbow to her midsection, an area that is directly connected to the back muscles and spine, going to the floor is not dramatic. It is the entirely logical response of a human body that is already compromised. And Clark did not stay down. That is the other part of this that gets buried under the flop conversation. She got up. She walked directly toward the officials. She confronted them about the call. That is not the behavior of someone who is milking a foul. That is the behavior of someone who is furious about what just happened and determined to make sure it does not get swept under the rug. The referees, to their credit in that initial moment, at least took the play seriously enough to initiate a review. They pulled up the monitor. They looked at the footage. They had every angle available to them. And this is the part that truly defies explanation. They came back from that review and called a common foul on Clark. On Clark, the player who took the elbow, not the player who threw it. Gray, having just caught Clark in the midsection with a deliberate elbow while using fakes specifically designed to manufacture that contact, walked to the free throw line. And Clark, who was already managing a serious injury and just absorbed a shot to the gut, got handed a foul. What makes this even more staggering is the specific officiating crew involved. This was the same crew that had been under intense scrutiny for 3 weeks following the Thomas incident on June 24th. These were officials who, more than any other crew in the league, should have been acutely aware of the conversation happening around Clark's safety and the quality of calls being made in games involving the Fever. They had every reason in the world to get this call right. They reviewed it with full video evidence and still got it wrong. Or, if you want to be more pointed about it, they got it wrong in exactly the same direction they have been getting calls wrong when Clark is involved for the entire season. The play itself, stripped down to its basic elements, is not complicated. Gray used fakes to create contact. The contact was an elbow to a player who was already injured. Clark fell. Clark got the foul. Gray got the free throws. The Aces got the benefit. And the Fever responded in a way that made the scoreboard look like a verdict on everything that had just happened. But before we get to the scoreboard, we need to talk about the call. Because what the referees did in that moment, with the monitor right in front of them and 3 weeks of public pressure about exactly this kind of situation hanging over the league, is something that demands a real explanation. And so far, nobody in a position of authority has given one. Let's be precise about what the WNBA's officiating crew did on July 12th, because the details matter and they paint a picture that is very hard to defend. The play happened. The referees on the floor saw it in real time and made an initial call. At that point, there was at least a reasonable argument that the live-action speed of the game made it difficult to process exactly what had occurred. Plays happen fast. Elbows can be disguised. Referees are human. That argument, while not fully satisfying, at least has some logic to it. But then the review happened, and the review removes every single excuse. When officials go to the monitor, they are no longer operating at live speed. They have the ability to pause, rewind, and examine the play from multiple camera angles at whatever pace they choose. They can look at Gray's footwork. They can look at the extension of the elbow. They can look at Clark's positioning and confirm that she was doing nothing that would make contact unavoidable on her end. They can see, frame by frame, the exact sequence of events that led to Clark hitting the floor. They did all of that, and they came back with a common foul on Clark. For context on how significant this is, the review was initiated specifically for a hostile act. That language is important. A hostile act review is not triggered by a standard basketball play. It is triggered when officials believe there is a possibility that something beyond normal physical basketball occurred. They looked at this play and thought, in real time, that it potentially crossed a line. And then, after reviewing it with full video evidence, they decided it did not. That sequence of events is not just confusing, it is genuinely baffling to anyone who watched the same footage. The fan reaction was immediate, and it divided exactly the way it always divides when Caitlin Clark is involved. On one side, Clark's supporters pointed to the obvious. A player recovering from a back injury, operating under a minute's restriction, took an elbow to the midsection, and the foul went against her after a video review. One fan's comment captured the sentiment of thousands when they posted asking how many times this has to happen before the league does something different. The frustration in that question is not just emotional. It is backed up by a growing list of incidents. On the other side, the anti-Clark voices moved immediately to the flop narrative. Social media posts called her dramatic. Accounts that have spent the season framing Clark's injury concerns as performance accused her of selling the contact. The phrase, flop queen, circulated. Calls for her to be fined for flopping spread widely. That narrative took hold in certain corners of the internet with a speed that reveals how prepared some people were to deploy it the moment anything happened. But here is why the flop narrative is not just wrong in this specific instance. It is actively harmful to the conversation this league needs to have. When you label a player who is already on an injury report, already missing games, already on a minutes restriction as a flopper every time she goes down, you create a framework where genuine injury responses get dismissed as performance. You make it easier for officials, commentators, and fans to look away from dangerous contact because the story has already been written. And in Clark's case, that story is being written by people who are either not paying attention to the injury history or who are choosing to ignore it because it is inconvenient for the narrative they want to tell. Several commentators and analysts weighed in on the call in the hours after the game. The consensus among those who had watched the play carefully was clear. The officials missed it. One prominent voice noted directly that they were watching the game live and thought in real time that it was more than a common foul. Another analyst pointed out that the league had already shown it was willing to act retroactively when it fined Thomas for the June 24th incident, which raised an obvious question. If the WNBA was willing to review and punish Thomas after the fact, why did the same standard not apply here when the officials had the footage right in front of them? That inconsistency is at the heart of what makes this situation so frustrating for Clark's camp, and for anyone who wants the WNBA to be taken seriously as a professional league. There is also a broader credibility issue at play. The WNBA has spent the past several years fighting to be recognized as a legitimate professional sports product. The league has made significant strides in viewership, in media deals, in mainstream attention. A significant portion of that growth is directly connected to Caitlin Clark and the audience she has brought with her. When the officiating in games involving Clark consistently produces outcomes that leave analysts, commentators, and fans shaking their heads, it does not just affect one team or one player. It affects the perception of the entire league. And on July 12th, with a monitor right in front of them and 18 days of context hanging over the league, the officials had a chance to get it right. They did not. What happened next, though, suggested that somebody higher up the chain was paying attention, because the conversation did not end on the court in Las Vegas that night. It was only just beginning. The reason July 12th hit so hard, the reason the reaction was so immediate and so intense, is not just because of what Chelsea Gray did. It is because of what it represents in a sequence of events that has been playing out since Caitlin Clark's very first days in the WNBA. To understand the full picture, you have to go back to June 24th. That was the date of the Alyssa Thomas incident. Thomas, playing for the Connecticut Sun, drove a fist into Clark's throat during a game that should have been an ordinary moment in a long regular season schedule. It was not ordinary. The contact was direct, it was visible, and it sent Clark to the injury report with a back injury that would cost her 5 games and leave her managing her health carefully for weeks afterward. The league's response to the Thomas incident was delayed enough to generate its own controversy. The WNBA did eventually fine Thomas, and that fine was acknowledged as a step in the right direction by many who had been calling for action. But the timeline mattered. The fact that it took the league time to respond, the fact that the officials on the floor during that game did not immediately flag the play as a hostile act, the fact that Clark absorbed that contact and had to keep playing through the immediate aftermath. All of that was already sitting in the background when July 12th arrived. 18 days. That is how long it took for the next incident to happen. 18 days between a fist to the throat and an elbow to the midsection. Both involving the Las Vegas Aces organization. Both reviewed by officials. Both resulting in outcomes that left the Fever and Clark's supporters furious. Now, it is important to be precise here. The Aces, as a team, are not sitting in a room and coordinating a strategy to injure Caitlin Clark. That would be a step too far, and it is not a claim that can be supported. But what can be observed, and what Reggie Miller, among others, has pointed out repeatedly, is a pattern. And a pattern does not require a conspiracy to be real. A pattern can emerge from a culture, from an attitude, from an environment where targeting a specific player is accepted or even quietly celebrated, because of what that player represents to certain people in the league. Miller is worth spending real time on here, because his perspective carries genuine weight. This is not a commentator who came to basketball last year. Miller played in the NBA during an era when physical play was a fundamental part of the game. He absorbed elbows, shoves, and cheap shots from defenders who made careers out of making his life difficult. He knows, better than almost any voice currently discussing this situation, what the difference looks like between hard basketball and deliberate targeting. And Miller has been watching Clark's situation all season from his platform on NBC, where he serves as one of the most respected voices in Indiana basketball history. He called the Thomas incident dangerous and deliberate. He was not hedging, he was not being diplomatic, he was calling it exactly what it was. And now, less than 3 weeks later, he is watching the same conversation play out again with a different Aces player, but the same general shape to the incident. The pattern, if you step back and look at it clearly, has several consistent elements. Clark takes hard contact. The contact is reviewed or not called. The foul, when assigned, goes in a direction that penalizes Clark or lets the player who initiated the contact walk away clean. The league responds slowly or not at all in the immediate moment, and Clark, every single time, gets up. That last part is the one that should be discussed more than it is. Because Clark's response to every single one of these moments has been to get up, to compete, and to win. She did it on July 12th. She confronted the officials, absorbed the injustice of the call, played through her minutes restriction, and was on the court while the Fever put together a 38-11 run that turned the game into a rout. But the fact that Clark keeps getting up and keeps winning does not make the pattern acceptable. It does not mean the league gets to continue looking the other way because the end result on the scoreboard is a Fever victory. The physical toll of absorbing this kind of contact while already injured is real. The 5 missed games are real. The minutes restriction is real. And the idea that a player should simply be expected to absorb deliberate elbow contact as part of the game, as some kind of rite of passage, is an argument that deserves to be examined very carefully. Because that argument, the "this is just physical basketball" argument, has been made by people defending every single one of these incidents. And it falls apart the moment you ask one simple question. If this is just physical basketball, why does it keep happening to the same player, in the same direction, with the same officiating failures attached to it? The answer to that question is uncomfortable for a lot of people in and around this league. And the Chelsea Gray suspension, which finally attached a real consequence to one of these incidents, suggests that at least someone in a position of authority is starting to feel the discomfort too. Every single time something happens to Caitlin Clark on a basketball court, the reaction follows a pattern that is almost as predictable as the incidents themselves. Within minutes of the play hitting social media, 2 camps form, dig in, and spend the next several hours shouting past each other, while the actual details of what happened get buried under the noise. July 12th was no different. If anything, it was a particularly vivid example of exactly how divided this league's fanbase has become around Clark and everything she represents. On one side, you had the people who watched the play and processed it through the lens of everything that has come before. A player already on the injury report. A player already missing games. A player operating under a minutes restriction because her body has been compromised by dangerous contact that happened less than 3 weeks ago. That player takes an elbow to the midsection, goes down, gets handed a foul after a video review, and the league's officiating crew walks away looking like they either did not understand what they were watching or did not care. For those people, July 12th was not a surprising moment. It was a deeply frustrating confirmation of something they had been watching build all season. The calls for the WNBA to take Clark's safety seriously, to examine its officiating culture, to acknowledge that something is systematically wrong with how these situations are being handled, got louder after July 12th than they had been at any point previously. On the other side, you had a set of voices that moved with remarkable speed to the flop narrative. Accounts that had clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of moment deployed it instantly. More Floppiana from the flop queen. The point God knew she flopped. She should be fined for every flop. These takes spread across platforms because they are easy, they are punchy, and they give people who have already decided they do not like Clark a neat and tidy way to dismiss what they just watched without having to engage with the injury history or the officiating record. The flop narrative is worth examining seriously because it does not just damage Clark. It damages the broader conversation about player safety in the WNBA. When you establish Clark is a flopper, as the default interpretation of every moment she goes down, you build a framework that insulates dangerous contact from scrutiny. You make it socially acceptable to look at a player who has missed 5 games with a back injury, who is playing under a minute's restriction, who goes to the floor after an elbow to her midsection, and say with a straight face that she is being theatrical. And once that framework is in place, it becomes very easy for officials, commentators, and league administrators to lean on it as cover for not addressing what is actually happening. There was also a broader societal conversation that erupted around July 12th, as there always does when Clark is involved. Questions about race, about privilege, about who gets protected in professional basketball and who does not, flooded the commentary space. Multiple voices raised the point that the attention given to Clark's injuries reflects a disparity in how the league and its media partners have historically covered players of different backgrounds. These are legitimate conversations that deserve genuine engagement, and they exist in genuine tension with the specific concern about Clark's physical safety. Both things can be true simultaneously. The WNBA has a long and documented history of failing to adequately compensate, promote, and protect players who built this league over decades before Clark arrived. And the WNBA also appears to have a specific, demonstrable officiating problem when it comes to calling dangerous contact on Clark's body. Acknowledging one does not require dismissing the other. But in the immediate aftermath of July 12th, those nuanced conversations were hard to find. What dominated the space was the binary. Either Clark is a victim of a pattern of deliberate targeting, or she is a drama queen who sells contact. The middle ground, where serious people could examine the specific play, the specific officiating decisions, the specific injury history, and draw measured conclusions, was largely drowned out. Reggie Miller's voice cut through some of that noise. His credibility in this space is essentially unimpeachable. He is not an outsider to physical basketball. He played in an era when the game was significantly more brutal than anything seen in today's WNBA. He has genuine affection and respect for Clark built through their shared work on broadcasts. And he has been consistent and clear in his assessment. What is happening to Clark goes beyond physical basketball. It is targeting, and the officiating failures that have accompanied every incident have made it worse. Several other commentators and analysts who watched the July 12th game closely echoed that assessment. The consensus among serious basketball observers was that the officials missed the call. That consensus did not generate the same volume of social media engagement as the flop narrative, because reasonable analysis rarely does. But it existed, it was substantive, and it pointed toward a conclusion that the WNBA could not continue ignoring indefinitely. And eventually, the league stopped ignoring it. The suspension of Chelsea Gray was the moment that changed the conversation from "when will the league act" to "what does the league's action actually mean?" That shift matters, and what it reveals about where the WNBA goes from here is the most important part of this entire story. Here is something that sometimes gets lost in the noise around Caitlin Clark's injury situation, around the officiating controversies, around the social media wars that erupt every time she is involved in an incident. The Indiana Fever are really, genuinely good at basketball right now. And on July 12th, they proved it in a way that made every argument about physical intimidation and officiating failures look small against the backdrop of a 34-point road blowout against the defending champions. Let's talk about what actually happened in that game, because the scoreline tells a story that deserves to be told fully. The Fever came into Las Vegas with Clark on a minute's restriction. That fact alone should have made this a competitive game. The Aces are the defending champions. They have a Ja Wilson. They have Chelsea Gray. They have veteran players who have been in high-pressure situations and know how to respond when their backs are against the wall. And their backs were absolutely against the wall after the first blowout 8 days earlier. This was the game where the Aces needed to show they still had the answers. They did not have the answers. The Fever built their lead methodically and then buried the Aces with a run in the third and fourth quarters that was as dominant as anything seen in the WNBA this season. Indiana closed the game on a 38-11 run, 38 points to 11. That is not a team getting lucky. That is a team that is executing at an elite level across the board, with multiple contributors stepping up and a system that is clearly functioning at a high level even when its best player is operating at reduced capacity. Sophie Cunningham was one of the biggest stories of that run. Cunningham has been a player whose contributions sometimes fly under the radar because Clark and Mitchell tend to dominate the statistical conversation around this Fever team. But on July 12th, Cunningham tied her season high with 6 three-pointers and finished with 20 points. During that decisive 38-11 run, she scored 15 points, which means she was personally responsible for nearly half of Indiana's output during the stretch that turned the game into a rout. That is a performance that would headline a game story on any other night. Kelsey Mitchell added 27 points and did something that puts her in genuinely historic company. She became the 5th player in WNBA history to score at least 25 points in 6 consecutive games. 5 players in the entire history of this league have done that. Mitchell is now one of them. That is the kind of achievement that deserves banner headlines and extended commentary. And it happened on a night when the broader narrative was dominated by a controversial foul call in the first half. Aaliyah Boston was quietly excellent in the way that Boston tends to be. 19 points and 11 rebounds on a night when the Aces had their best player, Aja Wilson, going for 20 points and 12 rebounds on the other side. Boston matched that production while also contributing to a team defensive effort that held the Aces to 75 points. For context, 75 points against a team that averages significantly more than that is the kind of defensive performance that signals a team is genuinely locked in. Clark herself, on a minutes restriction and dealing with a back injury and fresh off an elbow to her midsection, finished with 12 points, 7 rebounds, and 6 assists. Those numbers on a normal day would be a solid but unremarkable line. On this day, operating at reduced capacity after taking a hit that put her on the floor, they represent something more significant. They represent a player refusing to let the circumstances define her game. And then there is the Chelsea Gray line. Gray, who threw the elbow, who walked to the free throw line after the foul was called on Clark, who had the officiating go in her favor in the first half, finished with 15 points for the losing team, in a 34-point loss. At home, against a team playing without their best player at full strength. There is something almost poetic about that. The player who benefited from a deeply questionable foul call, the player who used fakes specifically designed to manufacture contact with an already injured opponent, ended the night on the wrong side of a historic blowout. The scoreboard, which doesn't care about narratives or social media arguments or officiating controversies, delivered its own verdict. The Fever's road trip ended with 3 wins and 1 loss across 4 games. 3 wins and 1 loss with Clark playing limited minutes, managing a back injury, and absorbing dangerous contact in multiple games. That record, in that context, is remarkable. It is the record of a team that has figured something out, that has built a genuine identity around toughness and collective execution, and that is not going to be rattled by circumstances that would derail a lesser group. The 109-75 final score is the kind of number that makes everything else fade into the background for a moment. All the debate, all the controversy, all the social media noise. And the Fever responded to every single bit of it by going on a 38-11 run and walking out of Las Vegas with a 34-point road win against the defending champions. As statements go, it was hard to argue with. But the statement that came from the league office in the days that followed was going to be just as significant, if not more so. When the WNBA announced that Chelsea Gray had been officially suspended, the reaction was significant and it came from multiple directions at once. For some, it was vindication. For others, it raised questions about consistency and timing. And for the people paying close attention to the bigger picture, it was a moment that revealed something important about where this league is and where it needs to go. Let's start with what the suspension actually represents in the context of everything that preceded it. The WNBA had already demonstrated a willingness to act retroactively when it fined Alyssa Thomas for the June 24th incident. That fine, while welcomed by many, was accompanied by criticism about the timeline. The league did not move immediately. The fine came after a period of public pressure, media scrutiny, and sustained conversation about whether the WNBA was taking Clark's physical safety seriously. The message the fine sent was important, but the delay in sending it created its own set of questions. The gray suspension suggests that the league has moved faster this time. Whether that faster response is a product of genuine institutional learning or simply a response to the intensity of the public reaction is a question worth asking. The cynical interpretation is that the WNBA acted because the volume of the conversation made inaction impossible to sustain. The more charitable interpretation is that the Thomas fine established a precedent, and the league applied it more swiftly when the next incident occurred. Both interpretations can be partially true simultaneously. What matters more than the motivation is the effect. A suspension carries more weight than a fine. A fine is a financial consequence. A suspension removes a player from the court. It costs a team a contributor for a specific period of time. It sends a message to every other player in the league that certain types of contact will result in missing games, not just paying money. That is a meaningfully stronger deterrent, and the WNBA's decision to escalate from fine to suspension represents a real shift in how the league is approaching these situations. But the suspension also raises a question that is important and uncomfortable. Why did it take this long and this many incidents to get here? Clark has been in the league since 2024. The documented incidents of hard and questionable contact directed at her body, contact that has either not been called or has been reviewed and let go, form a list that has been growing steadily across her time in the league. The Thomas fine was the first real consequence attached to any of those incidents. The gray suspension is the second. But between Clark's first game in the league and July 12, 2026, there have been moments that passed without any consequence at all. The officiating culture, which is the deeper and more systemic issue at play here, does not get fixed by a single suspension. The officials who reviewed the gray elbow on July 12 and called the foul on Clark are still the officials who will be working WNBA games going forward. The framework that allows reviews to produce outcomes like the one on July 12 is still in place. The suspension of gray is a consequence applied to a player. It is not a reform applied to a system. And without systemic reform, the conditions that produced these incidents remain intact. Looking ahead, the timing of this suspension creates significant context for the second half of the season. Clark is heading to the All-Star Game on July 25th in Chicago. The All-Star Game represents the kind of mainstream spotlight that the WNBA has been working to attract, and Clark's presence at that event guarantees a level of attention that the league genuinely needs. The last thing the WNBA wants heading into that moment is a sustained conversation about whether its officials are capable of protecting its most visible player. The suspension, in that context, functions partly as a statement to the broader audience. The league is paying attention, the league is acting, the league takes this seriously. Whether that statement is fully backed up by changes on the officiating side remains to be seen. For the Las Vegas Aces, the suspension represents a real sporting challenge. Gray is a critical piece of their operation. She is the veteran point guard who runs their offense, manages their pace, and brings championship experience to a locker room that is trying to defend a title while navigating a genuinely difficult stretch of results. Losing her for any period of games is a meaningful competitive setback, and it comes at a moment when the Aces are already dealing with the psychological weight of 2 home blowout losses in 8 days. Whether the Aces can respond and mount a genuine title defense in the second half of the season is one of the most compelling storylines heading into the remainder of the year. They have the talent. They have the experience. They have a player in Aja Wilson who is capable of dominating any game she is in. But losing Gray, even temporarily, disrupts something fundamental about how they function. For the Fever and for Clark, the suspension is validation, but not a finish line. The work of making this league safe for its most important player, of ensuring that officiating catches up to the reality of what has been happening on the court, is ongoing. The second half of the season will tell us whether the momentum generated by July 12th and its aftermath produces real change or whether it fades into the background the way previous controversies have. Clark heads to Chicago for the All-Star game, having absorbed fists and elbows and bad calls, and come out on the other side with a 34-point blowout win. That is the story of her season in miniature. And the story is far from over. Step back from all of it for a second. Step back from the specific plays, the specific calls, the specific social media arguments. Step back from the suspension and the fine and the debate about whether the WNBA is doing enough. And ask yourself this: what does it say about where women's basketball is right now that the most important ongoing story in the league is whether its most valuable player is safe on the court? Caitlin Clark has done something genuinely rare. She has taken a sport that was fighting for mainstream attention and made millions of people care about it in a way they never did before. She has done that while absorbing injuries, bad calls, and deliberate contact, and responding every single time by getting up and competing at an elite level. The Chelsea Gray suspension is a step. One step in a much longer journey toward a league that protects its players consistently and officiates its games credibly. Whether the WNBA takes the next step, and the one after that, is the question that defines what this league becomes. Clark will be back at full strength eventually. When that day comes, this league better be ready, because right now it is barely keeping up.